Okay, in this presentation, we will examine Armstead's brigade. They were a unique group of soldiers that this presenter likes to refer to as the Lions of the Dan. Popular lost cause narratives limit Armstead's brigade to the climax of Pickett's charge. In this attack, more accurately referred to as the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble assault, Armstead Brigade appears on the historical stage for one moment and then vanishes away. But there is so much more to their story, as you'll learn. These men actually have more in common with North Carolina soldiers than Virginia troops. North Carolina rightly boasts that her soldiers were the first at Big Bethel, farthest at Gettysburg, and last at Appomattox. Sadly, Virginia-centric lost cause myths unfairly upstage heroic Tar Heel contributions throughout the war. Coincidentally, Armstead's men were also at Big Bethel, Gettysburg, and Appomattox. They were all Virginians whose history shares much with North Carolina, and ironically, their four-year war record also falls victim to the same post-war propaganda that celebrates Armstead and Pickett. Fake news is nothing new. Napoleon said, "History is a fable that is agreed upon." This is certainly true of history I was taught growing up in the Richmond Public School, which was not just weighted in Southern apologetics, but especially skewed by Virginia's lost cause machinations. From the early years at Jamestown until well into the mid-20th century, the first families of Virginia dominated Virginia's politics, culture, and learning. These wrote Virginia history in a Richmond-centered Cavalier tradition. Pictured here are my 4th and 7th grade history texts. In them, there's no mention of the Civil War, but only the war between the states. And these texts depict slavery as a benevolent paternalism, the next best thing to Happy McDonald land. But the facts tell a different story. And if you note, there's even a fallacious illustration of George Pickett leading his charge on foot. So there is no wonder history is problematic. It's easiest for us to accept what we're taught at face value or what we read in popular histories. And separating fact from fable requires maturity and effort. Sifting facts and placing them in proper context is even harder. And in most cases, the best one can do is approximate truth with the best fit of available information. This challenge is what makes history so interesting and fun. Commonly accepted history of the Commonwealth of Virginia is virtually a Tidewater Virginia narrative, which only gives occasional mention to other regions in passing. King Charles I of England named the Carolinas for himself and set the northern boundary at the 36th degree parallel. As you can see from the Chesapeake Bay watershed and the Roanoke River watershed, Southside Virginia is really more North Carolina than it is Virginia geographically. The majority of soldiers in Armstead's brigade came from Southside Virginia, which has its own history apart from that of the Tidewater. And tonight we will ignore the voices in Richmond, for Southside Virginia has a legacy that is unique and very rich, has strong ties to North Carolina, but is obscured by the Cavalier fables of old Virginia. The development of the U.S. South would have been likely parallel that of the North had it not been for Sir William Berkeley. His name's spelled Berkeley, but it's pronounced Barclay. He was a favorite of Charles I, and when the Puritans in Parliament ruined his fortune, he finagled appointment as governor of Virginia and proprietor of North Carolina. And he arrived in Virginia just as a English Civil War erupted between Royalists and Parliament. And although Virginia had a large Puritan population, Berkeley remained fiercely loyal to the crown, but was eventually forced into exile on his plantation. The Puritans governed Virginia during the years of Oliver Cromwell's protectorate, and upon Cromwell's death, Berkeley usurped power and resumed the governorship in 1660. That same year, Charles II reclaimed the throne and declared Virginia an Old Dominion, and that's where Virginia gets its epithet from. Berkeley is best known for his bicameral legislature, but history ignores most of his less savory actions. For one thing, he banished all the Puritans and Quakers from the Virginia colony. These were forced to resettle in the Roanoke River watershed. And back in Jamestown, even though the first blacks arrived in 1619, indentured servants were more profitable because of the colony's high mortality rate. Honestly, aristocrats had just as soon work a white man to death. But when the mortality rate became lower, it made permanent slavery profitable. So in 1661, Governor Berkeley established permanent hereditary and racial slavery. The King of England, King Charles II, cut off the supply of indentures and established the Royal African Slave Company in order to monopolize the slave trade. Berkeley then stole lands, common lands, and failed to protect the commoners. This incited a revolt known as Bacon's Rebellion. When Bacon died of typhoid, the rebellion collapsed, and Berkeley retaliated by hanging about everybody he could get his hands on. For that reason, the king recalled Berkeley, but he died before he had audience with the king. So that's how early settlement of the Roanoke River watershed in Southside Virginia began. The people that settled there were very isolated. They had very little recourse in trade, and they just lived a Spartan existence. In 1793, construction of the Dismal Swamp Canal began between Norfolk and the Pasquotank River on the Albemarle Sound. When this was completed in the early 1800s, it began opening up river trade throughout the Roanoke River watershed. Because it was so isolated, the development of towns just didn't happen. And by 1830, the only recognizable town in Southside Virginia was the town of Danville. And even that would have taken a lot longer had it not been for Benjamin William Sheridan Campbell. Now, Campbell was a major general of Virginia militia and a visionary politician. He was one of the first families of Virginia descended from Powhatan and Pocahontas. He was responsible for establishing the first mill race and first mills on the Dan River, the bateau navigation of Danville, He advocated construction of the Richmond-Danville Railroad. He was a cousin of Vice President John Campbell Breckinridge, and his sons, he had 6 sons that would fight as officers for the Confederacy. He was such an advocate of military power that he established the Danville Military Academy in Danville. When the war broke out, the local militias were organized into regiments to fight, and the local militias in the Danville area formed the 18th Virginia. Well, once the 18th Virginia mustered, the governor sent Edward Claxton Edmonds, who had been the headmaster of the Danville Military Academy, back to Pittsylvania County to organize a regiment. The gentleman he appointed to help him was Lieutenant Colonel Powhatan Bowling Whittle, who was also a descendant of Powhatan through Pocahontas. Now, I understand last month you had a presentation on the CSS Shenandoah. Well, Powhatan Bowling Whittle's brother, William Conway Whittle, was the executive officer on the CSS Shenandoah. When the 38th Virginia mustered, it mustered in Richmond, and it was posted in Winchester. Now, I'll speak much on the 38th Virginia because 7 of its 10 companies came from Pittsylvania County. The rest came from Southside Virginia, and like 3/4 of Armstead's brigade, they all came from Southside Virginia, except for maybe 5 companies. Well, anyway, they were first posted up around Winchester, and when it became apparent that the Union was going to attack Manassas Junction, Johnston had his men march to the rail junction, the depot at Piedmont Station. There, they, for the first time, transported soldiers to a battlefield. It had never been done before, and it was a lot slower than they anticipated. They would have done a lot better if they'd have just all marched. But after Jackson and Bernard B. and most of E.K. Smith's brigades had made it to the battlefield, the 38th Virginia was stranded there at the depot. So they ended up missing the battle of First Manassas and ended up arriving there the day after the battle. Now, Colonel Edmonds missed the battle, but his family didn't. In fact, his mother, the former Helen Carter, was born there in the Carter mansion there on the battlefield. Now, her oldest sister, Edmund's aunt, was Judith Henry, who was in the Henry House on Henry House Hill and was killed during the battle. Well, after the battle, the 38th Virginia camped at Bristow Station, and in October, the family held a funeral for Judith Henry at Upperville. Now, Edmonds grew up at this first X here near Upperville, and in the neighborhood was the Armstead family. Edmonds and Frank Armstead were the same age, and they both entered Confederate service. Now, Frank Armstead's elder brother. The year that Edmunds and Frank Armstead were born, Frank Armstead's elder brother, Lewis Addison Armstead, entered the West Point Academy. Now, Frank and Lewis Armstead likely also attended the funeral of Judith Henry because they were there to bury their mother, who died a few weeks before the funeral there. Now, Lewis Addison Armstead had just become the first colonel of the 57th Virginia Infantry. Lewis Armstead was born into a stellar military family. He was a two-time West Point failure and actually resigned to avoid expulsion. But his father and grandfather secured him a commission in the U.S. Army. He was twice breveted for bravery in the Mexican War. But the thing to keep in mind is that bravery is not to be confused with competence, for he ended up holding first lieutenant rank longer than anyone in the U.S. Army. Now, Lewis Addison Armstead, as I said, came from a stellar military family. His grandfather was Colonel John Bowes Armstead, born at the Hesse Mansion in Matthews County, Virginia. That mansion still stands, by the way. Lewis Armstead was the son of Major General Walker Keith Armstead, who was a hero of the Battle of Craney Island in 1813, and the U.S. Army commander in the Second Seminole War. Lewis Armstead was the nephew of Major George Armstead, the defender of Fort McHenry during the 1814 bombardment that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. And he was named for uncles Lewis Armstead and Addison Armstead, both officers killed in the War of 1812. He was born February 14th, 1817 in New Bern, North Carolina, in the home of his grandfather, U.S. Senator John Wright Stanley. The Stanley House is still in New Bern. It's open for tours, or it was before the coronavirus crisis. And the house, incidentally, has been moved twice. The house originally stood where the courthouse stands today. Now, Lewis Armstead, contrary to popular images of Armstead in art and legend that portray him as the quintessential Southern hero, to the contrary, this student of Armstead best compares him to the fictional Captain Wilton Parmenter. You might remember him from a TV show.
The end of the Civil War was near when quite accidentally a hero who sneezed abruptly ceased retreat and he burst into victory. His medal of honor pleased and thrilled his proud little family troop. While pinning it on, some blood was spilled, and so it was planned he command that troop. Where Indian fights are colorful sights and nobody takes a lickin', where pale face and red skin both turn chicken. When drilling and fighting get them down, they know their morale can droop. As long as they all relax in town before they resume with a bang and a boom.
Now that analogy's fairly humorous, but it's not really that far-fetched. Like I said, he was commissioned by his father after his expulsion for his mess hall tantrum. He was promoted to captain in 1855, and that was because he wrote a letter to the Secretary of War complaining that he had been brevetted twice during the Mexican War and had held the rank of first lieutenant longer than anyone in the U.S. Army. They finally consented to his promotion and promoted him in 1855. In 1857, he briefly commanded Fort Riley, Kansas during a Cheyenne uprising. Reports that his efficiency rating there was really pretty low. His only battlefield command before the Civil War occurred in August of 1859, when his company of 50 muskets confronted 200 Mojave Indians who were armed with nothing but bows and arrows. They won the fight and returned, but Armstead, for some reason, took leave after that. And we don't see him back on duty again until early 1860, when he's reassigned quartermaster duty in Los Angeles. So in looking at Armstead personally, we have to keep perspective that the South was desperate for field officers. And there's definitely a vast difference between the demands upon a junior officer versus a general officer. Now, when Armstead was appointed colonel, it was in September of 1861. It was a couple of months after the first battle of Manassas. And so the War Department kept him in Richmond in reserve for a while, and they went into winter quarters in December. In February, the Union attacked and captured Roanoke Island. 2 days later, they attacked the Mosquito Fleet in Elizabeth City and destroyed the Confederate Navy there. So the War Department sent Armstead and his 57th Virginia to the North Carolina border. Most accounts say that it was at the confluence of the Blackwater and Nottoway River. Actually, you can find the fort right at after the confluence at the head of the Sheridan River there, at the site of the old Wayanoke Ferry, North Carolina crossing there. There they built earthworks to protect river incursions, but they didn't stay there that long. There's not much there left. You can access the site by water. I explored it a couple of years ago by kayak, but you can see the remains of some of the gun emplacements there in the photo there. On April 1st, Armstead was promoted to brigadier general and given a brigade that included his 57th Virginia, 2 Georgia regiments, and the 14th Virginia, which was pulled off of Jamestown Island and sent to join his brigade. During that time frame, Johnson pulled back from his Centerville line, and McClellan landed at Fort Monroe on the Virginia Peninsula. The Confederates under Johnston held McClellan at the Warwick River Yorktown line until early May. The 38th Virginia that we had talked about earlier did not participate in dam number 1 other than stand in a reserve during the battle. But also members of the defense line here that ended up part of Armstead's brigade was the 5th Virginia Battalion that supported artillery positions at Mulberry Island and Fort Hugger. I say Fort Hugger, actually Hugger pronounced his name something like Auger. But those units would eventually join Armstead's brigade. On April the 17th, Johnson decided to give up his position here. He regarded it as not defensible because his flanks were bordered by the James River that the U.S. Navy had gotten command of. But when on April 17th, Johnston ordered Norfolk abandoned, and so Hugger's division moved up the south banks of the James River, and on May the 3rd, Johnston's forces began pulling back to Richmond, stopping briefly to fight them at Williamsburg and Eltham's Landing. It took 12 days for the retreat to be completed there. But just before Seven Pines, as Armstead's brigade retreated up the south bank, he dropped his 57th Virginia off at Drury's Bluff and so proceeded to Richmond, where the day before the attack on the Union position at Seven Pines, Johnston shuffled around his regiments. He removed the 2 Georgia regiments from Armstead and in place gave him the 9th Virginia, the 53rd Virginia, and the 5th Battalion. Now, when Johnston attacked May 31st, it was right after a horrific thunderstorm. And due to a lot of confusion in orders, Armstead's brigade didn't do much of anything on the first day other than mark time in mud. But the 38th Virginia, as part of Garland's brigade, they were pretty heavily engaged on the first day. The Bucks County Historical Society in Pennsylvania has a painting that was done after the war called Rescue of the Colors. The Sergeant Purcell of the 104th Pennsylvania rescued the colors, and when he did that, he earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, the force that they were facing at the time was none other than the 38th Virginia, and we know that because Captain Griggs of Company K captured their left flank marker that day. But the 38th Virginia was chewed up pretty badly. They had a casualty rate of 42%, which was about the same number of killed and wounded that they would later have in Pickett's charge. Now, when they were relieved later that day, they were relieved by Armstead's brigade. And the next day, the 38th Virginia expected to go back into action, but they took up a reserve position along beside the landmark double houses of Seven Pines. Armstead's brigade, on the other hand, D.H. Hill borrowed regiments from other divisions to launch another attack on the second day. When he did that, Mahone's brigade approached a railway embankment, and the Union rose up from behind it and blasted his men. His men retreated and ran headlong in the Armstead's 53rd Virginia as they were coming on the field. The 53rd thought they were Union and opened fire on them. Armstead's 9th and 14th Virginia continued to press on toward the railway embankment, which if you go to Sandston, Virginia, and travel down I-64, you'll notice that the railway embankment is still there with an active railroad track on the other side of the interstate. Well, anyway, Armstead and his 9th with the 9th Virginia, they approached the railway embankment. They too were fired upon, and the 9th Virginia broke and ran. Armstead spent the rest of the day trying to rally the 9th Virginia. His 14th and 53rd Virginia continued to fight. Things got confused where the 53rd ended up firing on the 14th Virginia. I mean, it was just a disaster any way you look at it. Well, anyway, after the second day of Seven Pines, Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of the Potomac, and he insisted that all the brigades be brigaded by state. So Garland's brigade became a North Carolina brigade. They transferred the 38th Virginia to Armstead's brigade. And from then on, Armstead's brigade was composed of the 9th, 14th, 38th, 53rd, 57th for the remainder of the war. Now, after Seven Pines, Armstead's brigade in Hugger's division more or less maintained a defensive position just outside Richmond along the Williamsburg and Charles City Road there. On April 25th, McClellan decided to test the position. That was called the Battle of Oak Grove. Robert E. Lee oversaw the defense there. He was very anxious about it because Armstead, Ransom, and Holmes brigades were the only things standing between McClellan and Richmond. Lee had staged the rest of his army north of the Chickahominy. The next day, he attacked at Mechanicsville or Beaver Dam Creek, and the next day he hit the Union again at Gaines Mill. McClellan decided to retreat, and so during the Battle of Savage's Station, Hugger's division more or less marched and counter-marched up and down the Charles City Road until the Battle of Glendale. The Battle of Glendale was a very bloody rearguard action that saved the Union Army. Lee was very upset that his units didn't spring the trap that was set for them. And so the Union Army retreated to Malvern Hill. Now, on the morning after Glendale, Hugger sent a reconnaissance in force consisting of Armstead's brigade north toward the Glendale battlefield, and Armstead ran right smack dab into Robert E. Lee, who charged Armstead to move forward and to find out where the Union line was. Well, they came upon the Union line. Armstead and Edward Edmonds, the colonel of the 38th Virginia, climbed a ridge, and they noticed that the Union was lined across the front of Malvern Hill with nothing but artillery supported by infantry. Edmonds sketched out the Union positions, and Armstead carried the map to Lee. Lee had Armstead call up whatever artillery he could and issued orders that when Armstead thought it was proper to charge, that his men would charge with a yell, and that would be the signal for the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia to attack. Well, as the Confederates pulled cannon up to this, no sooner did they pull them up than the counter battery fire would knock them out. And those that weren't knocked out were the crews were picked off by Berdan's sharpshooters that were posted along this ridge here. Now, Armstead sent 3 of his regiments forward. He sent the 38th, the 14th, and the 53rd forward to clear Berdan's rifles away from picking off his artillery. And so what happened was that when Berdan's rifles retreated, then the artillery on the ridge opened up on the three regiments that were under the command of Edmonds. And so Edmonds moved them forward into this ravine that sheltered them from the canister fire. And so those 3 regiments ended up pinned down there for the rest of the afternoon. Well, the Southern artillery just didn't have the effect that was needed to merit an assault on the Union position. Well, later in the day, John Bankhead Magruder shows up and takes command of the field. He's been having stomach trouble. He's been taking opiates. He's irritated with himself that his division has been on the wrong road for the rest of the day. So when he shows up, he takes command of Armstead's sector of the field. But Lee decides that it's not a good thing to attack that day, but he forgets to cancel his order. So when Magruder orders Wright's brigade forward, they charge with a yell, and that initiates an all-out attack. So in the first attack, Wright's brigade and some other brigades and Armstead with his 57th and 9th Virginia that he had held in reserve come up. And when they reach the gully there, then his other 3 regiments also rise and join in the assault. Well, they're pushed back as more of Magruder's brigades arrive on the field. They launch assaults in piecemeal too. So there's a second assault, and in the second assault, the 57th Virginia breaks and runs through the 9th Virginia. To their credit, the 57th Virginia had sustained the worst casualties of any of Armstead's regiments that day. And so Armstead leaves the field with the 9th and the 57th Virginia, whereas Edmonds stays with the other three regiments of Armstead's brigade and charges the guns 6 more times. In the process, Powhatan Bowling Whittle loses his left arm to a canister ball. So by the time the sun sets and things gets dark, it's just apparent that the Confederate attack on the Union line was a dismal failure. And once things get dark, the Union withdraws. Armstead's brigade remains on the field for the next couple of weeks, cleaning up the battlefield, collecting arms, ammunition, burying dead, and so forth. They eventually are marched to Falling Creek on the other side of the James River, and Hugger is relieved of command and replaced by R.H. Anderson. Well, during this time frame, Abraham Lincoln had called John Pope from the West to head up a new Army of Virginia that consolidated McDowell, Banks, and Sigel's commands. So he's stirring up trouble in Northern Virginia, and Lee is chomping at the bit to get after John Pope. And so he leaves R.H. Anderson's division at Falling Creek to watch McClellan, who's still at Harrison Landing on the peninsula. So Jackson and Longstreet march after Pope, and when McClellan leaves the peninsula on August the 16th, then R.H. Anderson marches as well. The thing that becomes obvious is that no one apparently has been pleased with Armstead's performance at Seven Pines, and Lee even less with his performance at Malvern Hill. There's rumors of him being drunk. He was cited drinking brandy before the attacks began. And so Armstead ends up with his brigade from then on always at the end of the Army of Northern Virginia on every march. So as things develop in Northern Virginia, the Second Manassas campaign ends up with the Battle of Second Manassas. The first day was a clash of Jackson's troops against John Pope's. John Pope was thinking that he had bested Jackson and that Jackson's army was getting ready to retreat. But as the day progressed, Longstreet's wing arrives, and then in the middle of the night, R.H. Anderson's division arrives, but they arrive in the middle of the night. No one is there to guide them onto the battlefield. So they wander right onto the middle of the battlefield, right in line with the Union guns. They're warned just before dawn that they're right there in the middle of the battlefield, and so R.H. Anderson pulls his men back. And so as the sun comes up, the Union realizes, or the Pope figures that, hey, the Confederates really are pulling back. So he renews his assaults against Jackson, and late in the day, Longstreet launches an attack that stalls at Henry Hill. The Union line is hanging on by a thread. The only brigade in the Army of Northern Virginia that has not been engaged the whole time is Armstead's brigade. And they end up right on the Union flank at Henry Hill. An attack by them would likely collapse the entire Union line. It's getting dark, and Jeb Stuart rides up and informs Armstead of that fact, that yeah, the Union has consolidated their position making a last stand on Henry Hill, and their flank is wide open. But the Major General of Cavalry does not have authority to order a brigade of infantry forward. So Armstead, he's had some bad luck at Malvern Hill and Seven Pines, so he declines to attack in the fading light. So Jeb Stuart rides off, and by the time he catches up with General Lee, John Pope's withdrawn his army and saves his army from disaster, or complete disaster rather. Notice, if you will, the flag of the 38th Virginia, the flag of the 38th Virginia. This is a third issue wool bunting flag that was given them after Malvern Hill, because the flag at Malvern Hill had 50 holes in it, and the other regiments, the 14th and the 53rd, their flags are shot up pretty bad too. But the 38th Virginia was able to salvage their unit designation from their shot up Malvern Hill flag and sew it onto their new flag. So it was inherent battle honor on this flag that was later captured at Gettysburg. Well, after Second Manassas, John Pope's army retreats toward DC. McClellan takes over, and in the meantime, Robert E. Lee pushes north into Maryland. But before he pushes north into Maryland, he does something that's very unusual. He makes General Armstead provost marshal for the Army of Northern Virginia. There was no position like that before this campaign, and there would not be anything like it afterwards. So it appears that General Lee posted Armstead to this position to sort of keep him busy, keep him occupied and out of the way. And we see that when they get to Frederick, Maryland, he doesn't allow Armstead to be the provost marshal anymore. Instead, he puts a Colonel Bradley Johnson of the 1st Maryland in charge of that, and makes Armstead head of having a senior moment here, of morale for the Army of Northern Virginia. Before long, Lee pushes his plan forward to march in the Pennsylvania, but first he needed to capture the garrison at Harper's Ferry. So Robert Anderson's division, along with McLaw's, they are sent to Maryland Heights, opposite Harper's Ferry. Other divisions, Walker's takes the south side of Harper's Ferry, Jackson the west. And during that time, Armstead's brigade does more or less reserve rear guard protection for McLaw's and Anderson at Sandy Hook Road, while McLaw's fights the Battle of South Mountain at Crampton's Gap. Finally, Harper's Ferry surrenders, and by the time they accept the surrender, Lee is calling for reinforcements. So McLaw's and Anderson rush to Sharpsburg. When they arrive at Sharpsburg, the battle is just beginning. And so Jackson is calling for reinforcements in the West Woods. Lee sends McLaws to reinforce Jackson. Jackson says he needs another regiment. R.H. Anderson sends his most expendable regiment, which is Armstead. And so they join McLaws there in the West Woods. As soon as they get there, Jackson tells Armstead's men to lay down. Shortly afterwards, a cannonball comes bouncing over the hill and wounds Armstead. When Armstead is taken out of action, then they put Armstead's men into the front line of Sharpsburg. And as soon as they reach the front line there by the Dunker Church, the battle shifts to other areas of the battlefield, and they remain until the Army of Northern Virginia retreats. Now, when the Army of Northern Virginia retreats, Armstead's brigade, having suffered fewer casualties of any brigade during the bloodiest day of the war, they end up fighting the rear guard action at Blackford's Ford to safeguard the retreat for the Army of Northern Virginia. Once the Army of Northern Virginia is safely across the Potomac, then they retire to Martinsburg, where they stay a couple of weeks. And then Armstead recovers from his hurt foot, and the division marches down to Culpeper Courthouse. And there they stay until November of 1862. Now, in November 1862, Robert E. Lee reorganizes the Army of Northern Virginia, and Armstead's brigade joins the division of Major General George E. Pickett. Now, Pickett was quite a character. He, of course, it's general knowledge, he was last in his class at West Point. He came close to involving the U.S. in a shooting war with Great Britain in an incident called the Pig War. When he became colonel in charge of defense of the Rappahannock River line, his superior Theophilus Holmes refused to recommend him for brigadier general, but he was able to finagle appointment by political means and served respectably as a brigadier general at the Battle of Williamsburg, Seven Pines, and Gaines' Mill. What happened at Gaines' Mill was Pickett was wounded in the shoulder. A staff officer found Pickett, as he said, bewailing himself, being mortally wounded, calling for a stretcher. The staff officer, John Haskell, examined Pickett and claimed that he was okay and left him on his own. There's something to be said for that, because later Pickett appears at a field hospital. He has his shoulder wound dressed and walks away and goes on leave to recover with his love interest, LaSalle Corbell. Well, anyway, being the newest division commander, Pickett is put in middle of the line at Fredericksburg. He and Hood have reserve positions. The bulk of the fighting occurs to their left and to their right there. So Armstead's brigade more or less did very little at the Battle of Fredericksburg, but observed the fight that happened there. Once the Battle of Fredericksburg was over, the Pickett's division went into winter quarters there at nearby Guinea Station. In the winter of 1863, while in winter quarters, the brigades mustered together to have snowball fights. They were more or less pitched battles, brigade against brigade. But in other conflicts, Armstead never really got along with his colonels that were galvanized civilians. For one thing, the first part of January, Colonel Tomlin of the 53rd, who organized the regiment, resigned. He just had his fill of Armstead and his abuse. Colonel Dyer of the 57th Virginia had served as a company commander under Armstead. He was promoted to major when the regiment was reorganized in April after Armstead's departure. The colonel and lieutenant colonel who were voted in resigned, having had conflicts with Armstead, and then Colonel Dyer was promoted to colonel. He ended up resigning in winter quarters. Colonel Grammer, who replaced Tomlin in January, was able to stand dealing with Armstead for 2 months, and he resigned. Colonel Gilliam of the 9th Virginia, Armstead tried to force him to resign, but he refused to resign, but simply transferred to a different regiment. On the bright side, regardless of the reasons for the conflict, the replacements for the 9th Virginia, Major Phillips, had served as, was a VMI graduate. He had served as company commander, had commanded the 9th Virginia at Sharpsburg. Colonel Hodges was a VMI graduate. He organized the 14th Virginia. Colonel Edmonds was a VMI graduate. He organized the 38th Virginia. Colonel Aylett was a lawyer in civilian life, but his father was a major general of Virginia, a brigadier general rather, of Virginia militia. And Colonel Magruder, John Bowie Magruder, was a nephew of General John Bankhead Magruder and a graduate of the Albemarle Military Academy. So by April 1st, the regimental commanders in Armstead's brigade were grade A #1. They had military backgrounds, and regardless of Armstead's personality, whatever Armstead said, they normally did. In April, Longstreet's corps was sent to forage in Southside Virginia and North Carolina. Pickett's division was charged with laying besiege to the Suffolk while supplies were being gathered. He did lose 2 regiments temporarily. Those of Garnett and Kemper were detached to D.H. Hill at Washington, North Carolina, to lay siege to that town. The siege of Suffolk was really not much military action there other than the siege. one of the Union headquarters there, known as Riddick's Folly, is still there and is a museum for the Suffolk Historical Society. It's well worth a visit. Well, anyway, toward the end of the siege of Suffolk, the Battle of Chancellorsville breaks out, and Lee summons Longstreet's corps to Chancellorsville to support that operation. But of course, the Battle of Chancellorsville ends before Longstreet's corps ends up in position. After Chancellorsville, Lee pushes north again into Pennsylvania. And what happens, of course, is that they run into the Union Army at Gettysburg, the Army of Potomac at Gettysburg on July 1st. Fighting breaks out. They more or less carry the first day. The Union takes up strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge. Lee has left Pickett's division back at Chambersburg to garrison that town. On the second day, he summons Pickett to Gettysburg. They arrive late on July the 2nd, just as Lee launches his attack in echelon along the Union lines, which almost carries the position, except for a half a dozen miracles that day, they would have succeeded. But as the divine hand that is governing the affairs of men ruled that just wouldn't happen. So Lee proposes to attack the next day with Pickett's fresh division. However, things do not go along as planned, and Lee has had to change his plan 2 or 3 times. By midday, the plan involves Trimble, Pettigrew, and Pickett launching an attack centered on a copse of trees atop Cemetery Ridge. Armstead, of course, is positioned behind Pickett. He has always been last in line, and this time it just gets a little too much for him. So he tries to locate Pickett to see if he can't be moved to the left of Garnett, because there's certainly plenty of room to put him in the line. He can't find Pickett. He sends one of Pickett's staff officers to complain to Longstreet. Longstreet can't believe Armstead's pettiness and just sends a message back telling Armstead to pull up into line when the assault begins. Well, when the assault is launched, the plan was for Fry's brigade of Pettigrew's division to be the brigade of direction. And so everybody was to dress on the Fry's brigade. But what happened was that Pettigrew had less distance to travel than Pickett. And so Pickett starts his men off as Pettigrew launches their attack. And so by the time Pickett's men reach the angle, Pettigrew has already been repulsed. Now we know from letters from a Captain John Herndon in Company D of the 38th Virginia that Armstead's 38th Virginia reached the wall here at the angle. And what happened was that Trimble and Pettigrew had already been repulsed, and the 8th Ohio was already descending down the Emmitsburg Turnpike. Colonel Edmonds refuses the 38th Virginia to face the Ohio, and the other members of the Union Army that were coming over the wall to gather up prisoners from Pettigrew's repulse. And so what happens is that while Edmonds is refusing his left, he's struck in the head by a ball and killed. Powhatan Whittle, who, as you recall, lost an arm at Malvern Hill, is also there in the charge. He's wounded in the thigh and tries to raise himself up, and he's hit in the shoulder and his good arm. Somehow he makes it back to his lines. I'm assuming somebody put him on a blanket and carried him back. But that leaves Major Campbell in charge of the 38th Virginia when Armstead leads his men over top of the wall. Now, Armstead is pinned at the wall with Lieutenant Colonel Raleigh Martin of the 53rd Virginia. The 53rd Virginia was being led by Raleigh Martin at the time because during the preliminary bombardment, Aylett, you might recall in the movie Gettysburg, the character of Armstead points out William Aylett, who's a grandson of Patrick Henry. Well, Aylett never made the charge because he was struck down by a shell fragment. His blanket roll saved him. He was coughing up blood and knocked senseless and carried off on a stretcher. So Aylett never really made the charge, but Raleigh Martin is with Armstead at the wall, and Armstead turns to Raleigh Martin and says, "Colonel, we can't stay here." And Raleigh Martin calls out forward the colors, and when the colors reach the wall, then Armstead rises up and says, "Follow me, boys, give them the cold steel." And the rest is history. Armstead is wounded, his men are repulsed, and they make their way back to their lines. Well, during the repulse, Major Campbell is holding the flank here. Lieutenant Colonel White of the 14th Virginia is retiring the remnants of Armstead's brigade until he's wounded. And that leaves Major Campbell in command. He makes it as far as the Emmitsburg Road, and it's there that they clash with the 8th Ohio in hand-to-hand combat. The 38th Virginia loses their colors there. It's the last stand of colors captured in Pickett's charge. And so the charge is over. The men hobble back to within their artillery line. General Lee meets Pickett. He asks Pickett to organize resistance to prepare for counterattack. Pickett says that he no longer has a division and allows his men to go back to their staging area, their camp from the previous night, and he leaves the area completely devoid of troops there. And fortunately for them, the Union were too tired to launch a counterattack. So thus ends the drama there at Gettysburg, except Armstead ends up in the 11th Corps hospital. They don't think his wounds are that severe. He's wounded in the arm and the leg. A lot of accounts say he shot in the chest to justify his demise a couple of days later. But the Union doctor said he was only wounded in the arm and the leg, and they weren't that severe of a wound. But he dies in any event. Now, when the Army gets back, retreats, let me go back here. When they retreat back to Williamsport, Armstead's brigade is still under the command of Major Campbell. And when they get to Williamsport, Colonel Aylett comes out of the hospital and takes over a command of Armstead's brigade. What happens is that by July 10th, they receive mail, and Aylett receives a letter from his wife talking about how Union cavalry has ransacked their neighborhood. And it infuriates Aylett to the point where he orders that a dozen Union prisoners be executed. And they're lined up and they're ready to shoot these guys when a staff officer comes up and stops Aylett and tells him he can't do that. And so you know, Aylett never lives that down, that he was going to execute prisoners. Also, at the start of the campaign, Gettysburg campaign, Lee ordered that his men respect private property, and Aylett, contrary to that, said the heck with that and issued everybody matches to burn and pillage. So Aylett comes out of the Gettysburg campaign looking more like a rogue officer than anything else. Well, after Gettysburg, Longstreet's division is sent to Georgia, and they leave Pickett's division behind. Of course, Pickett's division was mauled in Pickett's charge, but Hood's and McLaw's division suffered pretty bad at Gettysburg too, and they're the ones that go with Longstreet to fight at Chickamauga. Pickett becomes the head of the division for North Carolina. And one of the things he does is that he sends Armstead's brigade under Colonel Aylett down to Kinston, North Carolina, as protection for the construction and outfitting of the CSS News, the ironclad ram that the Confederates were building and outfitting in Kinston. Now, while they're there, the brigade, Armstead's brigade, receives a new commander. He's General Seth Maxwell Barton. Now, Barton was just exchanged after being surrendered at Vicksburg. Seth Barton was from Fredericksburg, Virginia. He got his start as Jackson's chief engineer for the Romney campaign in 1862. And he was Jackson's personal choice to command the Stonewall Brigade when Jackson stepped down. However, Jefferson Davis refused to give Lieutenant Colonel Barton a two-step promotion. So Barton went west as colonel of another regiment and ended up being promoted to brigadier in short order. But while they're there at Kinston, Robert E. Lee approves a plan by General Robert F. Hoke of North Carolina, who knows that the town of New Bern, the Union-occupied town of New Bern, is just loaded with warehouses full of provisions and supplies that the Confederates need. And so Lee approves a plan, but Jefferson Davis will not let Hoke lead it. He says this operation requires a major general. So the only thing handy is General George Pickett. Lee does not care for this, but being the obedient servant that he is, Pickett's put in command. Now, Hoke's plan called for a four-pronged assault on New Bern. First, Hoke and his men would capture the outer defenses along Bachelor's Creek. Then Colonel Deering with cavalry would capture the Fort Anderson on the other side of the river. Seth Barton would command a wing of his brigade under Colonel Aylett, plus the brigade of Kemper and Matt Ransom and his North Carolina troops. Now, the fourth thing was that a flotilla of Confederate sailors and Marines would row down the Neuse from Kinston and attack the shipping, the gunboats here anchored off of New Bern. The plan should have worked except for one thing. They did not count on Bryce's Creek being what it was. Now, when General Seth Barton gets to Bryce's Creek, he's supposed to cross and attack these forts, and the sound of his gunfire would be the sound for Hoke and the rest of the main body to take New Bern. But what happens is that when Seth Barton gets there, they find out that Bryce's Creek is not some trickle. It's not a mill stream or a rivulet like the staff assumed. It's more or less a navigable river that's 90 yards wide and deep. And Pickett did not have the foresight of identifying this and providing Barton with pontoon bridges. So what happens is that even though Barton is stalled here, he still tries to go around, but it's just too long of a way to get around Bryce's Creek. So he sends word back to Pickett that he can't do that. Well, Hoke had already captured Bachelor's Creek, and they were waiting for Barton's guns when the messenger arrives and says that that's just not happening. And then Colonel Deering over here, something went wrong with that attack, and Deering sends a message saying he couldn't do that either. So Pickett plans on a general assault and orders Barton to cross the Trent River and to join him for a general assault on New Bern. But what happens is that the mud bogs down Barton, and by the time when Pickett expects Barton, he's only as far as Trenton, North Carolina. So Pickett throws up his hands and blames Barton for the failure. But Lee refused to blame Barton. He supported Barton, and that just infuriated Pickett all the more. So what Pickett did was, when Richmond started screaming for reinforcements, he detached Barton's brigade and sent them off to Richmond. One of the dark episodes of this adventure was that when when Hoke's men captured the works here at Bachelor's Creek, they also captured a lot of prisoners from the 1st and 2nd Union North Carolina Regiment. And what happened was that some of them were recognized as former Confederates. Well, these guys were locals. They had joined the North Carolina forces to defend North Carolina. They didn't join the Confederacy to defend the Confederacy. And so when New Bern was taken over by the Union, and their families were in Union hands, and these guys were left isolated, they ended up joining the Union North Carolina regiments rather than go off to POW camps. Well, anyway, Pickett declared them all traitors and ordered them hanged, and hang them he did. He hanged 22 of them, and it was nothing but a kangaroo court, and it was really the blackest smirch on Pickett's record. And in fact, after the war, Pickett had to scoot to Canada until he got assurance from U.S. Grant that he wasn't going to be tried as a war criminal. So in May, General Benjamin Butler launches an assault. Barton's brigade is up just east of Richmond, guarding bridges over the Chickahominy River. General Benjamin Butler lands at Bermuda 100. It's essentially the largest amphibious landing of U.S. troops until D-Day. And so what happens is that Benjamin Butler's intelligence is correct. And when he lands the Army of the James at Bermuda 100, he is essentially given an open door into Richmond. But for some reason, he piddles around until the Confederates organized a defense. Now, after New Bern, George Pickett was removed as head of the Department of North Carolina and dropped down 2 levels to the area of Petersburg. So he's now under the Department of Richmond. He organizes a defense against Butler's forces, and he's doesn't have much to deal with. Because not only has he been demoted, but most of his men have been stripped away and sent to Robert Hoke in North Carolina to attack Plymouth. So General Butler, excuse me, General Butler is piddling around here. General Ransom orders a reconnaissance in force to find out what Butler is doing. He sends Barton's men, Barton's brigade, the former Armstead's brigade, and they encounter the Union at Chester Station. Well, there's a big misunderstanding there at Chester Station, where Barton's aide is seen running around on Barton's horse while the reconnaissance and force is being stalled by the Union. And so Ransom blames Barton for incompetence and removes him from command. Now, while Chester Station is going on May 10th, Pickett is dealing with other Union issues, and he just flat has a breakdown, and it confines him to bed for 2 weeks. So after Chester Station, Benjamin Butler organizes for a push on Richmond, and he's stalled at Drury's Bluff. He ends up digging a trench line at Drury's Bluff and makes his headquarters at the halfway house. Now, the halfway house still stands, and in fact, until the COVID virus, it was in operation as a restaurant. It's really worth visiting if you're interested in a high-end restaurant. But the Confederates counterattack and drive Butler away at the Battle of Drury's Bluff on May 16th, and the Union start digging a trench line across Bermuda 100. The Confederates dig a counter trench line opposing them, and General Grant throws up his arms, saying that Butler is bottled up, as if in a bottle tightly corked. Pickett, by the way, the Purdue House that was a feature on the Chester Station battlefield was there in 1978 when I took this picture. It has since been torn down and modern housing built in its place. The Winfrey House, which was a feature at the crossroads there at Chester Station, is still there. And it's right there at the edge of a cemetery. But soon after Benjamin Butler is bottled up, Grant pushes south to Spotsylvania Courthouse and the North Anna River, and eventually Cold Harbor. By the time there's a battle at the North Anna, Pickett's recovered from his breakdown, and Lee assigns his division as a mobile reserve under his personal direction. And so Pickett's men, they are nothing more than reserve units for North Anna and later for the Battle of Cold Harbor. What happens is that when Grant leaves Cold Harbor and crosses the James River and attacks Petersburg, Petersburg is very sorely pressed, and General Beauregard, who's now in command of the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia, pulls the division of Bushrod Johnson off of the Bermuda 100 line and saves Petersburg. This leaves the Confederate trenches empty, and so the Union fills the Confederate trenches. Lee orders Pickett's division and Field's division to attack the Union line. Just before the attack, Lee has second thoughts and calls off the attack. Fields receives orders not to attack, but Pickett doesn't receive the orders in time, and so he orders his men forward. And so Pickett's men advance from the Winfrey house toward a position in the Confederate line called Mrs. Gray's farm. And so Pickett's men charge with their banners flying in the rebel yell, and Field's division find this irresistible, so they charge too and end up retaking the Confederate line there. By the afternoon, Lee is inspecting the retaking of the line, and Pickett's men hold that line for the remainder of the war, essentially, from July well into March of 1865. In September of 1864, the brigade receives another permanent commander, and this is Brigadier General George Maryland Stewart. Now, Stewart had been recently exchanged, having been captured at the Muleshoe at Spotsylvania Courthouse. This absolutely infuriates William Aylett, the colonel of the 53rd Virginia, because Aylett, he commanded Armstead's brigade after Gettysburg. He commanded it before Barton took over. When Barton attacked New Bern, he commanded the brigade during that attack. And when Fry left, Colonel Fry left, he commanded the brigade again. So he fully expected promotion to brigadier general. He threatened to resign, but ended up staying there. At the same time, Colonel George King Griggs becomes the colonel of the 38th Virginia. Now, like I said, they manned the Bermuda 100 line up until the early part of 1865. General Lee was not happy with Pickett's treatment of his men. He rebuked Pickett for having lax morale and not providing for his men. And so what he did, he relieved them off of the Bermuda 100 line and replaced them with Mahone's brigade. Once again, Pickett becomes Lee's mobile reserve. Sheridan is running rampage around central Virginia. So Lee sends Pickett to Fredericksburg, to Farmville. They go to Manchester and they take the railroad to Farmville. Well, there's no cavalry attacking Farmville. Sheridan is seen elsewhere. So Lee recalls Pickett from Farmville. But what happens is that most of the morale of Pickett's division is gotten very low, and Pickett has done his men a favor by essentially giving them a ride halfway home. So in the time period that Pickett is in Farmville, his desertions account for 3/4 of the desertions in Longstreet's division. Pickett's men make it back to Richmond. They're sent north of Richmond chasing Sheridan's cavalry again. And when they don't find Sheridan's cavalry, and there's when Sheridan is spotted having made it to Grant's position, then Pickett returns to Richmond. Mysteriously, Pickett has a case of diarrhea, so he goes into town and recuperates with his wife and his baby son. During that time, George Maryland Stewart takes charge of his division. William Aylett takes charge of the brigade, and they take up positions outside of Richmond. When John Gordon comes up with an idea of attacking Fort Stedman to shorten the Confederate defense line, he asks for Pickett's division, but Lee tells him he can have Pickett's division, but they might not arrive in time. So George Maryland Stewart takes Pickett's division to support the attack on Fort Stedman. What happens is that they get there just as the attack is ended. And so they just take up a defensive position in the works at Petersburg, and George Pickett returns from his illness and rejoins them. Lee then sends Pickett on a mission to counter Sheridan again at Dinwiddie Courthouse, and this Pickett does, and he successfully pushes him back at Dinwiddie Courthouse, but finds himself isolated. So he pulls back to Five Forks, and when he does that, he receives a telegram from Lee telling Pickett to hold Five Forks at all costs. So Pickett runs off to a shad bake on the other side of Hatcher's Run, and in the process, the Union surround and surprise him, and his division is decimated. It's a very few escape, and so the remnants try to make their way back to Confederate lines. Lee relieves Pickett of command. There's some doubt whether or not he received that order relieving him or not. But the remnants try to make it across the Appomattox River at Exeter Mills, but find the river swollen. So they work their way up the south bank of the river. They go through Amelia, hoping to find supplies at Amelia. They don't find supplies there. They keep going. They end up being confronted at Sailor's Creek, where they're again hit pretty badly by Union forces pursuing them. They're chased off again and cross the Appomattox at Farmville and make their way to Appomattox, where they take up positions across the road. On the morning of the 9th of April, they take up a reserve position at a village with the ironic name of Pleasant Retreat. And they're standing when Lee surrenders. On April 10th, word reaches Jefferson Davis at the Sutherland Mansion in Danville, Virginia, that Lee's surrendered. And so the government had relocated there the week before. Davis leaves the Sutherland Mansion, and when he steps off the porch, Confederate Virginia is over and done with. The formal surrender of Lee's army occurs on April 12th, and there's a lot of debate whether or not George Pickett was there. He probably was not. George Stewart, who is in charge of the brigade on the retreat, of the division on the retreat, was left Appomattox Courthouse to Lynchburg. He would soon follow Jefferson Davis in his retreat south through Georgia. When the formal surrender occurs, the brigade is surrendered by Colonel George King Griggs of the 38th Virginia. And so ends Armstead's brigade. The Lions of the Dan were the best of men and the worst of times. They fought like lions. They were often led by jackasses. This one fact is clear, that throughout all history, until Christ returns to set up his kingdom on earth, God shakes the kingdoms of this world such that only unshakable things remain. The American Civil War was such a shakeup. Last year at the Danville Museum, I stated that with secular abandonment of God and his commandments, we may well live on the verge of yet another shaking. One could hardly imagine then the events of 2020, which reinforce this idea. We currently deal with a generation of revisionists who seek to erase our past. Let us not confuse that with properly revising narratives based on best information. Novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn often quoted an old Russian proverb, "Dwell on the past and you'll lose an eye, forget the past and you'll lose both eyes." The Lions of the Dan challenge us to rediscover and preserve Southside Virginia and North Carolina history, especially its dissenter past from which sprang this nation's Bible Belt. Early Southside Virginians and North Carolinians loved liberty, especially their liberty in Christ. They rested in the promises of God, among them the promises of Jesus, that if you seek, you will find. May our study of history always be a means of worship of God in spirit and in truth, and in recognizing his sovereign hand in the affairs of men. To God be the glory. Thank you all for your kind attentions.
Well, thank you, Ken. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Have we got any questions? I don't see any on the chat line. Does anybody have a question for Ken? Well, I'm not quite sure what happened there. Hi, Jim. Have you got any questions?
How long did it take you to research your book?
I would say 40 years. What happened was, yeah, back in the late 70s when Roots came on, I decided to check on an ancestor, and he and his brothers were in the 38th Virginia, and the more I dug, the more I uncovered, and it just snowballed. And
how did you know when you were done?
I got sidetracked for about 10 years when I discovered a trial that had been covered up, and I was scared to death I was going to die before I could publish that information. And I got to the point where, it's like every time I turned around, there was some new fact popping up, some letter, or somebody in Danville would find something in their garage or attic or something like that. And it just came to a point where, hey, if if I don't get this information published, I'm going to die, and it's not going to get out there. So that's basically why I published when I did.
What did the some of the soldiers in their letters have to say about the role of the brigade and the way that they were used throughout the course of the war, especially the Pickett's Charge?
Well, the thing that stands out more than anything is that in April of 1862, the Confederate government passed the conscription law, and of course the 1861 volunteers, they were hot to go. I mean, they were rabid to join the military and to fight to defend the state, whereas most of the others that were conscripted later, they were family men. They were men with farms and families and children that they had to provide for. And most of the 1861 volunteers, they were single men that were more or less looking for adventure. There was there's one particular individual that tugs at my heart more than anything, and this gentleman, he was drafted in 1862 and put in the 38th Virginia. Now, his brother had joined the 38th Virginia and had died of typhoid in September. I mean, a full 10% of the 38th Virginia died in the first 6 months of deployment from disease. And so this guy's brother had died and he was drafted. Well, after Antietam, Sharpsburg, he gets a letter from home saying that his 5 young daughters had all died from a yellow fever, scarlet fever rather. And so he's trying to get home. You know, his wife and son are the only people left, and he's lost his 5 daughters. And so he asked his father to find a replacement for him. Well, Colonel Edmonds doesn't accept replacements in the 38th Virginia. Well, one of the people I'm related to served in the 57th Virginia, and his brothers were in the 38th. And so they made a deal to where if this guy, Mahan, found a replacement, this guy would, in the 57th, would take his place in the 38th, and the colonel of the 57th allowed substitutes. So, but Mahan never found a substitute. The substitutes by that time were few and far between and too expensive anyway. And he hangs in there. He doesn't desert. He hangs on and does his duty, writes a lot of sad letters home, and ends up being captured in Pickett's Charge and dying at Port Lookout. I mean, it's just terrible.
Ken, I want to thank you very much, and I want to let everybody know that his book, Lions of the Dan, is available on Amazon and other outlets. And the book that he referred to that kind of sidetracked his Civil War research for a number of years is called Murder at Green Springs. And that's a interesting account of a murder case involving, if I've got this right, Ken, a ancestor of your wife's.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. We found out about it by accident. Sharon's Sharon's mother was taking care of her dad and her grandfather, and she pissed him off, and he said, "You're just like your grandmother, the murderer." And that was the first thing the family had ever heard of that she had done time in prison. And so Sharon's mom looked it up in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and she was expecting a little column about yay big talking about it, and she was like front page news for like 6 months. It was the biggest surprise her family ever had.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to let everybody know that's on the line that our plans for next month are subject to change, but at this point we plan to have Betty Vaughn talking about 19th century Christmases in early November. And with that, I'll sign off, and thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next month, if not sooner. Thank you.
Thank you so much.